Hello and welcome back to my channel, or hello if you're new here. My name is Andrea and I am the face behind the crochet brand COSMAUDÍ. But in today's video, I'm actually talking about a knitted project. So this is my Nebula hood. It's my first knitted hood. I've worked on many crochet hoods before, but not a knitted one, and I'm super happy with how this came out and super excited to share this pattern with you all. So today's video tutorial is not meant to be a standalone video tutorial, but rather it's supposed to accompany the pattern that again has the written instructions as well as photos throughout. But yeah, today's video tutorial more walks you through every single step throughout the pattern. So again, I won't be listing specific stitch or row counts, but I will be walking you through every single step, holding your hand throughout. So hopefully if you are just a beginner knitter, you know, maybe you worked a couple of projects before, but nothing that involves too much shaping or too many techniques, hopefully this will be a very good kind of next step project for you, because yeah, I really hold your hand throughout the whole process, and obviously I'll have the different steps marked as timestamps in the description box below so that you can skip around throughout the video if you need to go back or skip forward past some steps. So feel free to use this video tutorial as much or as little as you would like as you go ahead and knit your Nebula hood. I'm just going to put it on real quick so that you can see how fabulous you will also look by the end of this video. It has been keeping me warm this winter, and it's great to wear a beanie underneath. I usually wear this with another crochet beanie I have, and with that and the hood, I do not get cold at all. So yeah, this is what it looks like on. I really like it, and hopefully you like it too. So if you really are a beginner knitter and want some kind of tips and tricks on where to start, I recently put out a video that's specifically geared towards crocheters wanting to learn how to knit, but I think it's a good resource for beginner knitters in general. So I'll go ahead and link that one also down in the description box below so that you can have kind of a starting point if you don't know where to start. But yeah, my hope is that many beginners can knit this hood for themselves, for friends, as gifts, for whomever you want. I think it's a very fun project, and it especially looks really nice in this yarn that I've used. Alright, I think that's everything I wanted to say, so without further ado, let's get started. For my yarn, I am using this lovely yarn. It is called Noro Ito, and I am using it in the colorway number 3, which is called Yubari. So this is 100% wool, and it is an Aran weight yarn. I highly recommend using this yarn if you can. It is really lovely, and it is so much fun to work up and just watch the colors kind of emerge as you work. But I completely understand that this is not accessible for everyone, so I have listed some alternatives in the pattern, and most Aran weight yarn should work. Just make sure to check with the gauge in the pattern. And if I'm not mistaken, I think you will only need one ball of this yarn of Noro Ito, which is yet another reason to buy it if you would like and if you have access to it. Alright, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start now. So I'm just going to begin by casting on the number of stitches directed to me in the pattern. So I am making the smaller of the two sizes, and I'm just going to use the long tail cast on to add the stitches to my needle. And I have a whole separate video going over some of the kind of basics of knitting, especially if you are a crocheter learning to knit. In case you don't know and are new to my channel, I am mostly a crochet designer, but I am starting to delve into knitting patterns. So I put out a video with some tips for crocheters learning how to knit, or in general if you just want to learn how to knit. So I'm going to link that video down below, and it has a more detailed tutorial on how to do this cast on that I am doing. So go ahead and watch that if you're not sure about how to cast on stitches. But again, I'm just using the long tail cast on to cast on my directed number of stitches here. Alright, so I have gone ahead and cast on the number of stitches for my size, and now I'm going to turn my work to begin working along those stitches. And my first row is going to be a wrong side row. So the entire hood is worked in stockinette stitch, but for our wrong side rows, we're going to do something a little bit different than just purling. So we are going to add something called a selvage stitch. So our first and last stitch of each row, wrong side and right side rows, will always be knitted. So I'm going to knit my first stitch, which is my selvage stitch, And then I'm going to go ahead and purl across my row until I have one stitch left. Then for that last stitch, I'm going to work it as a knit row. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that off camera and meet up with you when I have one stitch left. So here I am just finishing up the last stitches here of my first row, which again is a wrong side row. And then when I get to the last stitch, I am not going to purl it, but rather I'm going to knit that stitch. And what this is going to do by always knitting the first and last stitch of each row is it's going to give us a nice kind of garter stitch edge along the side of our work, which will make it a little bit easier to pick up stitches in later on. So that was my first row. It was a wrong side row. And now for my right side rows, all you're going to do is just knit across. So even that first stitch and the last stitch, we're going to knit all the way across. Just regular knit stitches. And actually, once you finish that, that's all you need to know for this first section for the top of your hood. You are just going to repeat rows 1 and 2. Obviously, wrong side rows correspond to row 1, right side rows correspond to row 2. And you're just going to keep working until the pattern tells you to stop. The pattern will tell you how many rows to work for your size. And you just want to make sure that you end on a wrong side row. And make sure that you count your rows so you know how many to work. One more thing is that I am actually using my longest set of needles for this first section. You'll notice that the work itself is not so long, or rather not so wide. So you may be wondering, why do I need to be using my longer set of needles? It's because the next step will involve adding many more stitches to our work. So right now we're just essentially creating the top of the hood. So we're going to get a rectangle that's this wide and it will be slightly longer than it is wide. So again, you may be wondering, why do I need such long needles? The next step will be working stitches along the edges of our rectangle, picking up those stitches, and that's when we're going to need the longer cable. So that is why I suggest that you do this step, work this rectangle with your longer needle so that you don't have to switch later on. But again, I'm just going to go ahead and repeat rows 1 and 2, and I'm going to work until the pattern tells me to stop. Okay, so I have finished working the number of rows that the pattern tells me to, and I finished on a wrong side row here. So I've just worked a simple rectangle in stockinette, but again, I worked those selvage stitches, so I should end up with an edge that looks kind of like this. We get these little knots on the edge of our work, and that's just to help us pick up stitches in our next step. So I'm going to leave these stitches on my needle like this, but I'm actually going to cut my yarn. So I'm going to give myself a nice long tail of yarn so that I can go ahead and weave this in later on. Now I have my rectangle here. I've just cut my yarn and I'm going to leave these stitches on my needle. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pick up stitches along this edge of my rectangle. Then I'm going to work across my row here, my previous row, and then I'm going to pick up stitches along this edge of my rectangle. So I'm going to turn it so that the right side of my work is facing me. This is my stockinette side. And I'm going to rotate to begin working along this long edge of my rectangle to meet up with these stitches here on my needle. To do this, I'm going to take my tail end of yarn, and I want to try and work my first stitch into the corner here of my cast on stitch. And I find that it helps to have a crochet hook handy. So here I've just grabbed one of my crochet hooks. And let me see if I can find that first edge. So I'm just going to do my best and insert here. It's a little bit hard to see, especially because I have this kind of tweedy yarn. But I'm just going to insert my hook and pull up a loop. Now that I've gotten my first stitch here, I'm going to bring my right needle, and this is why I was saying you might want to use your longer needles is for this step precisely. So I'm going to now bring my right needle And I can actually slide these stitches further down so there's no risk of them coming off of my left needle. And with my right needle, I'm going to pick up the correct number of stitches along this edge. So the pattern will tell you how many stitches you need to pick up for your size. And a good rule of thumb is to pick up about 3 stitches for every 4 rows. So I can see my rows here. I can see I have 1, 2, 3, 4. So I want to make sure I pick up around 3 stitches. So I already have my first one here. Then to pick up into my next row, I'm going to insert my needle right here underneath this strand of yarn. I have an opening here. I'm going to insert my needle, and then I'm going to just yarn under and pull up my loop. If you're struggling with this step, I do recommend using a crochet hook. This one's a little bit too small. I would recommend using one that's like a little bit bigger than this. And you can go ahead and just bring your yarn through and pick up stitches that way with your crochet hook. But this works fine as well. So I'm going to go into the next hole. I'm going to insert my needle. Then I'm going to yarn under and pull up. So I've just picked up 3 stitches here. Along 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. Then I'm going to skip the next one, and then I'm just going to continue picking up stitches along this edge. And this is why we work that garter stitch edge, so that you can work into the little kind of holes here along the edge. So let me do a few more. I'm just going to insert my needle and pick up a stitch, insert my needle, pick up a stitch. So I'm going to continue doing this along the edge of my rectangle until I reach the point where I was just working here. So I'm going to try and get as close as I can. I'm going to try and pick up stitches in my penultimate row from the one that I had previously worked. So I am almost done picking up stitches here along the edge of my rectangle. I'll go ahead and straighten this out in a second, but I just have 1 stitch left to work into, and so I'm just going to go into the edge here and yarn under and pick up a stitch. So once I've done that, I can go ahead and stretch my stitches out, and let's see if we can see kind of what I've just done. So as you can see here, now I have the correct number of stitches on my needles, and I have now picked up stitches here along the edge of my rectangle so that I can go ahead and knit these stitches a little bit later on. So now that I have picked up these stitches here, I can go ahead and work along my previous row here. So we ended on a wrong side row, so that corresponds with the fact that we're now working on the right side. So now I'm going to just knit across. So again, this is why I suggest that you use your longer needles for this step. It's going to take a little bit of finicking around playing with this here, but just scrunch up those stitches here on your left needle and go ahead and knit the first stitch here, making sure to not pull so much so that you pull that tail end of yarn undone, and just knit across your stitches. You probably will feel that it's a bit tight here just because we are working essentially like around a corner. So just keep working, and you may have to pull your needle out and work as if you are working the magic loop, depending on how comfortable or uncomfortable this feels for you. I may have to do that later on, so I will show you that technique in just a second. But here I'm just knitting across, working those stitches as a normal until I reach the other side of my rectangle. So it is feeling a little bit tight, and I'm pretty sure we're gonna have to do this magic loop-esque technique once I finish here. Okay, so now that I have worked along the previous row here, I have 2 of the 3 sides that I want to work into worked, and now all that's left to do is pick up the stitches here along this edge of my rectangle, and it's going to be the same number of stitches that you picked up along this edge. Just make sure to work the last stitch as close as possible here to this slip knot that we worked, because we want this edge to be nice and crisp. So with my same right needle, I'm going to continue picking up stitches, but obviously it's very hard to turn like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull my needle out of my work like this. And this is what I was referring to when I said using kind of a magic loop-esque technique. My stitches are still, you know, on my cable here, on my cord here, but now my needle is loose and free to move. So I can go ahead and just pick up those stitches as needed. So in the same edge here, I'm just going to go ahead and start picking up stitches. Again, it's around 3 stitches picked up for every 4 rows. So just take your time. And I'm just going to continue picking up the correct number of stitches for my size as directed in the pattern along this edge. And I will meet up with you once I am done and show you how I work into that kind of first row where we worked, where our slip knot is. Okay, so I'm just finishing picking up the stitches here along this edge, and I just have 1 stitch left to work into, so, or rather 1 stitch left to pick up. So as I commented before, try and make sure that you work into that corner here so that the edge of the hood is nice and crisp later on. So I literally just worked into this corner here where my tail end of yarn is coming out of, the initial tail end of yarn that we used for our long tail cast on. And as you can see, you know, I only have these stitches here on my right needle, and the rest are somewhere along my cable. So if I stretch out my stitches that I've just picked up, we can kind of see our work starting to take shape. So we have our rectangle that we worked here in the center, and then we have these stitches that we just picked up along this edge. We worked along the previous row, and then we have these stitches here that I've just finished picking up here. And as you can see, I have this loop of my cable here. So for the first couple of rows, you'll likely need to kind of play around with your needles to figure out what is most comfortable for you, because we're going to be rounding this corner here. But from this point onwards, we're just going to repeat what we did for rows 1 and 2. So this row that we just worked was a right side row. So I'm going to turn my work now, and I should have a couple of tail ends of yarn. No worries, we'll get those out of the way later on. Or if you want, you can weave them in right now so that they're not in your way. And we are just going to repeat what we did for row 1. When we are working our main rectangle. So we're still going to work our selvage stitch. So my first row my first stitch rather, I will knit, and then I'm going to purl the rest of them. So with the stitches here on this edge, I am going to push them to the tip of my needle, and I pulled out my right needle, or what is now my right needle, out a little bit, and just push these up a little bit. And so my first stitch here of my row, I am going to knit, but then I'm going to purl the remainder of my stitches until I reach the very last stitch, where I will also work a knit stitch. But for now, I'm just going to purl all of these stitches, and then I'll show you what I do when I reach the end here. So I am almost done purling all of these stitches here. I'm just going to keep purling till I reach the end here. And now I'm going to let go of my left needle here, so I still have this much. And now I'm just going to pull my cable out here from, it doesn't have to be exact, but I would say pretty much the other corner of my top rectangle here. And I'm just going to pull my cable out. So I've just picked a random spot here along the corner of my rectangle. And once I've pulled my cable out, I can push those stitches up to the top of my left needle. So I've just essentially kind of transferred my loop over here. And now once again that my stitches are up here to the front of my needle, I can go ahead and continue with my wrong side row. So I'm just going to continue purling all of my stitches again until I reach this point where I pulled my cable out. And then once I reach that point, I will just repeat the same thing. I'll pull my cable out or move my needle around, and then push the remaining stitches to the front of my left needle. So I will still show you how to do that on camera, but it's just a little bit of playing around with your needles and cable so that you can work around all 3 sides of your rectangle. Okay, so I'm just finishing up here. I have 2 stitches, now 1 stitch left to work here. Perfect, so I'm gonna set my left needle down. Right now I have all of these stitches on my right needle. I can even stretch them out a little bit. And my left needle is all the way over here. My cable is all the way over here. And now I'm gonna pull here at the bottom of my cable to bring all of these stitches onto my left needle. Let's see, I just push them up here. And once again, I'm just going to continue purling across my row. And here also, for example, I'm turning the corner, so it still feels a bit stiff. I feel like I can't exactly work comfortably. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull my right needle up and out a little bit to give me some more flexibility here so that I can go ahead and work across this row. So like I mentioned before, it's just a lot of playing around with your needles, and the good news is you only have to do this for a couple of rows just until we even out those corners. So once I've pulled out my right needle, I can go ahead and continue purling across my row, across those stitches that I picked up. So I just have 3 stitches left to work into, so I'm going to purl until I have 1 stitch left, and then remember that this is actually just a repeat of row 1. So I want to make sure that I always work the first and last stitch of every single row as a knit stitch, no matter if the other stitches are purl or knits. The first and last stitch here, it's the last stitch, are always knitted. And I'm just going to give a little tug here so that my work doesn't come undone. All right, so if I pull my stitches out and loosen them like this, we can see we're once again left with this little loop, and now we have worked around the 3 sides of our rectangle once more. So this is what it looks like on the wrong side. It is a little bit messy, so like I mentioned before, if you want to go ahead and weave these tails of yarn into the underside of your top rectangle here, the top of your hood, go ahead, completely understand, so that you can get them out of the way. I'll likely do so in just a second. But yeah, I just want to flip it to the right side so you can see what we're doing. So once again, we're just working along the edge, the 2 edges of our top rectangle and along the previous rows. So once I have just worked this row, I'm just going to go ahead and repeat working as I've been doing in stockinette for the rest of my rows. I'm not going to increase anymore or pick up any stitches, any additional stitches. I'm just going to keep working along my row here. So your stitch count should not change. And once we work more stitches, we're going to work the body of the hood. So essentially what's going to happen is if I fold the top of the hood like this here, once we work more stitches, or sorry, more rows rather, we're going to create the body of the hood. All of the length here will come, and this is what I was talking about earlier. You won't have to pull out your cable anymore because the corner here will be a little bit more smoothed out or rounded out. But yeah, basically the body of the hood will just continue from here on out. So I'm just going to continue knitting along my stitches here, and again just keep pulling out your cable and adjusting as needed until you no longer need to do it once this is a little bit more rounded out, until the pattern tells me to stop. So the pattern will tell you how many rows you need to work for your size and some tips on how to measure, make sure that you are on the right track. Alright, so I am back after working the majority of the body here of my hood. This is what my work is looking like so far. If I were to turn it upside down, this is what it would look like. So as you can see, this is the top rectangle that we worked at the beginning. Right now we can definitely see our hood starting to take shape, and like I said, after you picked up the stitches and started working those rows, there was no increases or anything anymore. So once you worked a few more rows, it would look like this. So obviously the pattern will tell you how many rows to work for your size. And once you've reached this point, now we're going to work some increases along the beginning and the ends of our rows to begin to shape a little bit for the face. So we want our hood to kind of curve like this so that it sits nicely around the chin area of the face. So the last row that I worked was a wrong side row. So now I am ready to turn my work and work back along the right side. So I'm going to work my first increase row here in the main body of my hood. So to begin, I'm going to work 3 stitches as normal. So I'm going to just knit 3 stitches as normal. 1, 2, 3. And now I'm going to work an increase here. So this first increase that I'm going to work is called a make one left. So to do this, I'm going to take my left needle here and I'm going to go into this bar, this horizontal bar that kind of connects my 2 stitches here. So I'm going to take my left needle and going from front to back, I'm going to pick up this bar and then I'm going to knit it through the back loop. So I'm going to try and insert my needle through the back loop. It's okay if it's a little bit tough. Actually, it should be a little bit difficult. If it's too easy, you're probably doing it wrong. And once I've done that, I can go ahead and just knit through the back loop of that horizontal bar. And now I should have 4 stitches here. So once I've done that, I'm going to keep knitting across my row until I have 3 stitches left to work into, because once we get to that point, then we're going to work a make one right. So I'm going to continue knitting across and I'll show you how to do that once we reach the other end. Okay, so I have worked across the majority of my row here. I just have a few stitches left to knit. And remember, you want to make sure that you stop when you have 3 stitches left. So I just need to do one more. So right now I have 3 stitches left to work on my left needle. And now I'm going to work another increase, but this time instead of working a make one left, we're going to work a make one right. So to do this, you're going to take your right needle and you're going to go ahead and in the same horizontal bar as before, this one that connects this stitch and the one that I've just knit, right here, I'm going to take my right needle going from front to back and put that horizontal bar on my needle like so. Now for the make one left, we knit in the back loop, but for the make one right, you're going to knit in the front loop. And once again, this should be kind of difficult to work, so if it feels too easy, you are probably doing it wrong. But once I have my needle through that front loop, I can go ahead and just knit it. It again is a little bit tricky to work. And once I've done that, I can go ahead and finish the 3 stitches that are left on my needles, finish knitting those. And there we go. I've just worked my first set of increases. So it's a little bit tricky to see, but this 4th stitch from the left to the right is the one that we increased. And same thing on the other side. This 4th stitch is a new stitch that we increased right there. So that is the first of my increase rows, and you will always be working increases with the right side facing out. So now I'm going to turn my work and work another wrong side row. So as always, make sure to start by knitting the first stitch of the row. The first and last stitches of every single row will always be knitted, even if it's the right or the wrong sides. So I'm just going to knit my first stitch, and then I can continue purling all the way across my row. So I'm just going to continue working a wrong side row, and my next right side row will again be another increased row. The pattern will tell you how many increased rows to work, and they're all worked as the one that I've just shown you. You're going to knit 3 stitches and then increase, and then continue working all the way across your row until you have 3 stitches left, increase again, and then finish off the row. So I'm going to go ahead and work all of my increases off camera, and I'll meet up with you once I'm done. Alright, so I am back now, and I have finished working all of my increases. Here you can see It's a little bit hard to tell because of the yarn, but you can see here that I have worked some increases. These are all new stitches that I created using my make one left and make one right techniques. So this is on this side, and then if I were to turn my work, you can also see here that we indeed also increased on this side. So the last row we worked was a wrong side row. And now we are ready to work a right side row, but in this next one, we're actually going to join our work into a round. So at this point, I suggest pulling out your shorter needles here because we will no longer be able to work with these long ones since the circumference of what we're working will be too short to use these long needles. So I have my shorter circular needles here, and essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to just knit across the entire row. And then once I get to the end, I'm going to cast on new stitches, and then I'm going to go ahead and begin working in a round. So I'll go ahead and walk you through that. So right now I have my stitches here on my left needle, and I'm going to bring my yarn to the back so that I can go ahead and begin knitting. And sorry for the lighting, there's a lot of clouds today, so hopefully it won't interfere too much. And now I'm going to grab my right needle here of my shorter set. You can see it's this one with my red cable here. And I'm just going to begin knitting as normal. So just essentially transferring my stitches from one set of needles to another. So I'm just going to knit all the way across my work. And eventually all of my stitches should be on my new set of needles. So I'll go ahead and do that off screen and meet up with you once I'm done. Okay, so I am nearing the end of my row here, and as you can see, most of my stitches are already here on my shorter needles. And I forgot to mention this before, but if you want, you can go ahead and put a stitch stopper on this right needle of my new set of needles, just in case you feel like your stitches will slide off. You can go ahead and put a stitch stopper here to make sure that that doesn't happen. But I'm almost done, so I know that I'm good to go. I shouldn't have any stitches sliding off. And I forgot to mention earlier, but in this row we're not increasing or anything like that. We're really just knitting our way across. Alright, so I have now transferred all of my stitches from my longer set of needles to my shorter set of needles. And this is perfect because now we're going to go ahead and start working in the round. So what that means is I'm going to be working only with one side of my work facing out. Right now, since we had been working flat and in rows, we are turning our work at the end of every single row. But now when we're working in the round, we're always going to have the right side facing us, which means that we're always going to be working knit stitches from here on out. Okay, so now that I have all of my stitches here on my shorter set of needles, I'm ready to begin working in a round. So to do this, I want to be able to connect this end of my work and this end of my work. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to cast on some stitches here in the middle. So if you can imagine, this is what your hood is looking like. These are the stitches that are going to sit right around your chin. So the pattern will tell you how many to work, but I'm just going to use the backwards loop cast on method. So essentially what you're just doing is you are just twisting your yarn to create a little loop, and you're going to place that on your needles. So let me walk you through how I'm doing this. It depends really how you want to get comfortable here, but what I essentially do is I place my thumb underneath my working yarn, and then with my index finger I take the top strand of yarn here and I just twist it so that my left thumb sits on top, and I've just created a little loop there. So that is my first stitch that I'm casting on. Alright, so let's do that again. I've just casted on one new stitch. I'm again going to just twist my yarn and create a little loop there, and that's my second one. So you're just twisting your yarn to create little loops, and those new loops will become stitches on your needles. And again, these are the stitches that will be sitting right underneath your chin once we are done with the hood. And I'm gonna go ahead and stop here and make sure I count how many stitches I work, because this will be important when we work the drawstring later on to make sure that our eyelet, when we work the drawstring eyelets, to make sure that those are nice and centered. So I'm gonna go ahead and count, make sure I have the right amount. All right, so I went back and counted, and I do have the correct amount now. And as you can see, I have also placed a stitch marker in the center of these new cast on stitches. So this center is going to mark the center of my face ribbing later on, the one that will work to create kind of the channel for the drawstring. So this will be, again, super helpful for when we are creating the eyelets for the drawstring. So I've just used a locking stitch marker. I'm not going to remove this until I'm ready to work the face ribbing around the opening of the hood here, but that won't be until later on. So just make sure that you get a locking stitch marker, place it in the middle of these cast on stitches, and just leave it there for now. I'm also going to take another stitch marker, and this one is this cute little cherry one. And I'm going to use this as my beginning of my round marker. So I want to make sure that all of my stitches here aren't twisted or anything like that. We can see the bottom is aligned in all of them. And now I'm just going to place this marker here. And this marker I'm going to use and move every single round to help me figure out where I have started and ended my rounds. So once I have gone ahead and placed both my stitch markers after casting on my new stitches, I am really truly ready to begin working in the round. So I'm going to bring over my left needle to my right needle, and I'm just going to begin knitting as normal, but I suggest that you try and really make this first stitch kind of tight since we have a bit of a gap here. Otherwise you will end up with a little bit of an unsightly gap. So just for this first stitch, try and make sure that you work with the tips of your needles as much as possible. I'm pulling my working yarn kind of tightly just to cinch that space closed and working this stitch a bit more tightly than I usually would. Now, once I have worked that first stitch, I can go ahead and just work all around in knit stitches. And so I'm going to continue working this off camera, and I'll meet back up with you once I reach around this point and show you how I work into these. It's the same as you usually would, but they are a little bit trickier to work into, so I'll go ahead and show you my process for working into these. All right, so I am approaching the end of my round here. I have worked around the almost the entirety of the round, and now I am reaching the point where I cast on those new stitches using the backwards loop. So I'm just working my last few stitches here, and I can see that I'm about to start working into those newly casted on stitches. So I'm going to pull those as tightly as I can to work with the tips of my needles. I find that they're much easier to work into if you are working in right here along the tip of your needle. And just like normal, I'm just going to go into this front leg and knit as normal. The first round of these is the trickiest, but then once you work into them for one round, then they're much easier to work into. So don't worry if you're struggling with this part, that's perfectly normal. Just take your time. And again, I try to work these as close to the tips of my needles as possible. And try and keep the same tension throughout as well, so that you're not working too tightly, since that can be difficult to work into later on. And yeah, even the marked stitch, I'm going to work as normal. I'm just going to move that stitch marker kind of out of my way. Oh, that's the next stitch, sorry. Let's keep going. There we go, marked stitch. I've just moved the stitch marker out of the way, and I'm just knitting as normal. So once I have finished knitting those newly casted on stitches, I'm just going to slip my beginning of the round marker from my left needle to my right needle, just like this, and that tells me that I've gone ahead and completed one round. So after that, I can just go ahead and literally knit to my heart's desire. Every single stitch, we're just knitting. Notice we don't have any selvage stitches anymore. You shouldn't be purling for any reason anymore. You are just working knit stitches all the way around your work. So we want our hood to have a bit of a neck, some neck fabric. So I'm just going to continue working this until the pattern tells me to stop, or until, you know, if you decide you want a longer neck or a shorter neck, go ahead and keep working until it's as long as you would like. But I'm going to follow the instructions in the pattern, of course. So I'll meet up with you once I have some more fabric here. Alright, so I am back now and I have worked quite a few more rounds here. So here you can see this is the stitch marker that marked the midpoint of those backwards loops cast on stitches that I had made. And then I just worked a few more rounds until the fabric was as long as I wanted and followed the instructions in the pattern. And now I'm going to work one final piece here along the bottom of the neck. I'm going to work a short piece of ribbing here. So this will be worked in 1x1 rib. So if you've never worked it before, you are just alternating knit stitches with purl stitches. So here is my beginning of the round marker. So I have just finished my last round of regular stockinette, and again now I'm going to work my rib stitches. So to begin, I'm going to knit one, and once I've knit one, I'm going to purl one, just like this. Then again, I'm going to knit one, and then I'm going to purl one. So I'm just going to repeat this along the entirety of my round. And it's important to note that we should have an even number of stitches. That way we end with a purl, and then the next stitch for the next round is again a knit stitch. So you definitely want to double check, make sure you didn't accidentally add or decrease any stitches here, because we want an even number to work our rib across. So again, I'm just going to work knit one, purl one, all the way across. And it's a little bit tricky to see now, but if you get confused, the purl stitches are the ones that have this little bump in front. So that is a purl stitch. And the knit stitches look like the ones that we have been working on the front of our, or rather on the right side of our hood. So purl stitches have this little bump here. You can also go back and count. So your odd number stitches will be knit stitches. So this is my first stitch, so that's a knit stitch. This is my third stitch, that's a knit stitch. This is the fifth stitch, that's a knit stitch. And your purl stitches will be your even stitches. So the second, fourth, and sixth stitches and so on will be purl stitches, in case you get confused. But once you work a few more rounds, it becomes much more clear which ones are the purl stitches and which ones are the knit stitches. But when you're just starting out, it can be helpful to literally say knit and then purl, and again knit and purl. It seems a bit silly, but it definitely helps keep you on track, especially for the first few rounds if you have never worked ribbing before. But yeah, I'm just going to work a few more rounds of ribbing until it is as long as I'd like, and then I'm ready to bind off. Okay, I am back and I have finished working my ribbing. So here you can see this is all stockinette, and then here you can see I was working in 1x1 rib, and so these are the knit stitches, and then if you were to open it, you could see these are my purl stitches. So once the ribbing has reached the length in the pattern that's described in the pattern, or of course if you want to make your ribbing section longer, feel free to do so, I am ready to bind off now. I no longer need my beginning of the round marker because this will be the last round that I work. So I'm going to bind off in pattern. Here you can bind off with whatever method you choose. I just prefer binding off in pattern here. I think it's one of the simpler methods of binding off. And because this part's going to be scrunched up around our neck, it doesn't need to be so pretty or anything like that. So to do this, I am going to work my first two stitches as I've been working them. So I'm going to knit one, and then I'm going to purl one. Once I've worked those first two stitches, I'm now going to use my left needle, the tip of my left needle, to pass this first stitch that I knit over and off of my right needle. So I'm going over the second stitch, my purl stitch, and I'm going over and I'm letting it go. Alright, so now I'm going to work the next stitch. So I'm going to knit this stitch, and once again I'm going to take this second stitch from the tips of my right needle here, and with my left needle I'm going to pull it over like so. Again, I'm working in pattern, so this next stitch is a purl stitch, so I'm going to work it as a purl stitch, and then I'm going to slip this, slip this stitch over. And I want to make sure that I'm not working this too tightly. So just try and keep your tension nice and loose. It takes a little bit of practice. And this step is a bit finicky, but just take your time and cast off all of these stitches off the bottom of your work. So I'm going to continue casting off until I've worked all the stitches off my needles, and I'll show you what my work looks like then. Alright, I am at my last stitch here, and so the last stitch is a purl stitch. I'm still going to slip this stitch over my last stitch, and then here I just like to finish off by cutting a nice long strand of yarn here to give myself a nice length to weave in. And then I'm gonna pull this up just like this, and then with a darning needle I just kind of connect the first stitch that I bound off with this last stitch, kind of just woven like this, and then back into the last stitch that I bound off. There we go. So I'll weave this end in later, but I have just bound off the bottom of my hood, and unfortunately I can't fit it all into frame here, but if we take a look at it piece by piece, we have the top rectangle, then we worked along 3 sides of it, worked. Here we worked those increases at the beginning and the ends of our rows. And then we cast on our backward loop stitches. We place the stitch marker that will help us in the next step when we work the ribbing around here, the face opening. Then I worked more rows here to add some fabric to the bottom of my hood, and then just worked some ribbing here at the bottom and bound it off. So the next step will be to work the face ribbing and create the eyelets for the drawstring. I have gone ahead and cut and tied my yarn here, and I'll weave in my ends later. But now I need to get a new strand of yarn, and I'm going to once again be using my shortest needles here for the face ribbing. So to begin, I'm going to find this stitch marker, and I'm going to begin picking up stitches. So I'm going to pick up 1 stitch along each stitch here that we casted on. So I'm just gonna go here and pick up a stitch. So this is very similar to the way we were picking up stitches, or rather it's the same way we were picking up stitches when we worked along the edge of our top rectangle. So I'm just going in there and picking up my first stitch. Okay, then I'm moving on to the next stitch, and so on. So I'm just picking up 1 stitch in every stitch. Alright, and once I've picked up the first couple of stitches here along the bottom edge, now I'm ready to begin picking up stitches along the side here of my main body of my hood. Now the pattern will tell you approximately how many stitches to pick up, and just remember that you are working into this edge here where we have these kind of knots. So between every set of knots you can pick up 2 stitches. So between these 2 I can pick up 1, 2. Between these 2 I can pick up 1, 2. Between these 2 I can pick up 1, 2, and so on. You can also help guide yourself with the other stitches here, so you know how many rows you're working into. So I'm just going to continue working and picking up stitches, as many as the pattern tells me to, for my size of my hood. And then once I get around the top, I'm going to do the same thing I did here on the bottom. I'm just going to pick up 1 stitch for every stitch here at the top, and then once again we'll follow the instructions on the pattern to pick up the stitches on the other edge, and one more time pick up all the stitches here on the bottom. So next time you see me, I will have picked up all of the necessary stitches along the edge of my hood. Alright, so I have gone ahead and picked up all of the necessary stitches around the opening here of my hood, and now I'm ready to begin working once again in rounds. So I am going to go ahead and remove this stitch marker that was helping me figure out where I needed to begin picking up my stitches, and I'm once again going to use another marker for my beginning of the round. So I'm just going to slip that on here, and now I'm ready to begin working it once again in 1 by 1 rib. But for this, I'm actually going to start in purl, so in a purl stitch. So my first stitch of my round is actually going to be a purl stitch. And make sure that you're holding on to the tail end of yarn here while you work the first couple of stitches, just so that your stitches don't come undone. So work the first stitch as a purl stitch, and then the next stitch will be a knit stitch, obviously, then a purl stitch, and then a knit stitch, and so on. So it's important that you have the right number of stitches before you begin working in rounds, just to make sure that you have an even number so that you can in fact work in 1 by 1 rib. So I'm going to continue just working on 1 by 1 rib. I'm going to work for 3 rounds, and then for my 4th round I'm going to do something a little bit differently, because that's where we're going to create the eyelets for the drawstring later on. So I'll meet back up with you then. Okay, so I have now worked 3 rounds of ribbing, and I am now beginning my 4th round. I've already slipped my beginning of the round marker, and I am ready to work the eyelets in this round. So this purl stitch here that's on my needle, on my left needle, that marks the very first and centermost stitch. So I'm going to work these first 2 stitches, and then where this 3rd stitch is, which is my purl stitch here, that is where I'm going to work my first of my 2 eyelets. So I'm going to purl and knit, and what I'm essentially going to do is I'm going to increase and then decrease all in one step here. So to work an increase and what will essentially become my eyelet, I'm going to do a yarn over. So I'm just wrapping my working yarn here around my right hand needle. So this is me creating a new stitch essentially, so this is why I just said it's an increase. But now I'm going to decrease by working these 2 stitches as 1 stitch. So I'm going to knit these 2 together as if they were 1 stitch, and what's going to happen is that this knit stitch is going to come over my purl stitch and it's going to sit right there, and then this new stitch that I've just created will become my new purl stitch here, but we'll leave a nice gap here for our drawstring to come through. So once I have done my yarn over, I'm just going to knit those next 2 stitches together as if they were 1 stitch. And that is literally all I have to do. Now I have a nice hole here, and this is where my drawstring will come out of later on. So once I've done that, I can go ahead and continue working in pattern. So my next stitch is a purl stitch and then a knit stitch. And I'm going to continue all my way around until I have just a few stitches left, and then I'm going to do the same thing. So I'll go ahead, finish this off, and come meet up with you when I have around 5 or 6 stitches left to show you this step again. Alright, so I am reaching the end of my 4th round here, and I just want to work until I have 3 stitches left. So I have 5 stitches left right now, so I'm going to do 2 more. Or rather, sorry, you want to work until you have 2 stitches left, sorry. So I'm going to work 1 more, so I'm going to do a knit stitch. And then this is where I'm going to work my 2nd eyelet here. So after working this knit stitch, again I have 2 stitches left in my round. I'm going to work another yarn over, and then once again I'm going to knit these 2 stitches together. Just treat those 2 stitches as 1 stitch, and there we go. I have just worked my 2nd eyelet right there for my drawstring, and now I can slip my beginning of the round marker over and continue knitting and pattern, and I'll show you what happens when we get to that point where we worked our yarn over. So I've purled 1, knit 1, and here when I reach my yarn over, I'm just going to purl this like a regular stitch. Let me work a couple more stitches just so you can see that eyelet. So I'm going to work 1, 2, and let me do 1 more stitch, 3, and then if we pull our work apart, we can see that we have a nice little eyelet here, so this will be for our drawstring later on. So now I'm just going to continue working in rounds of 1 by 1 rib until the pattern tells me to stop, until my ribbing is thick enough, because remember, we're going to actually fold it in half and then sew it or knit it shut to create the channel. So it's going to seem probably a little bit thick, but don't worry, it's twice as thick as it really will be in the end. So I'm going to go ahead and work those rounds off camera. Okay, so I have finished working all of my rounds here of my face ribbing. As you can see here, we have our 2 nice eyelets that we worked in the 4th round, and then I just continued working. And now I am ready to finish off my face ribbing and work it down so that it is half of the width that we have right now. So you have a couple of options for this. The first option that I'm actually not going to show on camera is you can go ahead and bind off all of your stitches in pattern just exactly the same way you did down here. So, you know, purl, knit, and then slip the rightmost stitch over the leftmost stitch once they're on your right needle. So just bind them off. Then cut a long tail of yarn and sew your edge down. And when you sew it down, you would sew it down here where we picked up the stitches in the first row, or sorry, first round of ribbing. So that is one way to create your channel for the drawstring. But I'm actually going to show you another way in which we knit our face ribbing down and create the channel by knitting. So this is a seamless way to do it. I just prefer doing this so that I don't have to do an added step of seaming. But you know, if you want to go ahead and bind off your stitches and then seam them down, that works perfectly fine. So I am now going to remove my beginning of the round marker since I am working my very last round. There's no need to keep track of my rounds anymore. And essentially what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be knitting my purl stitches together at the base, so where they are worked here. Then I will knit my regular stitches here on the right side as normal, and I'm going to cast them off as I go. So for my first stitch, which should be a purl stitch, I'm going to go ahead and find the corresponding base here. So remember that purl stitches on the right side are knit stitches on the wrong side. So this stitch is this stitch. We can follow this column here. And I'm going to find this loop here. Let me get a needle to show you. I'm going to want to work into this loop here at the bottom of this column of knit stitches on the wrong side. So with my left needle, I'm going to pick up this loop here. And obviously I just used this darning needle here to help me, but you can even use your right needle to help pick up that loop. And once I have picked that up, I'm going to just knit those 2 stitches together. So just work those 2 stitches, or rather 2 loops here as one. And there we go. So I have 1 loop here on my right needle, or 1 stitch here on my right needle. Now my next stitch is a knit stitch, so I'm just going to knit that as normal. And then I'm going to cast off by passing this stitch over the one I just knit. Alright, so let's do that a couple more times. So my next stitch is a purl stitch here. So if we look on the wrong side, I'm going to follow that column, which should be a knit stitch, and actually it's where we worked our eyelet. So following this down. It's a little tricky because it shifts over here, but this is the column we want to grab. So if I look at the very base here, I can see that I want to work into this. So once again, I'm just going to put this on my left needle, and then I'm going to knit these 2 together. So just treat them as 1 stitch, knit them together. And then once I've done that, I can go ahead and slip this off of my needle. Then the next stitch I'm going to knit and then cast it off. We're back at a purl stitch. So I'm going to find the corresponding column of knit stitches on the wrong side, and I see that I want to work into this loop here. It's a bit hard to tell because my yarn is kind of dark there, but I can go ahead and just use my right needle instead of that darning needle to pick this loop up and place it on my left needle. Then I can knit those two together. And then once I've knitted them together, I can go ahead and slip that other needle, or slip that other stitch off my needle. Then again, knit one stitch and slip it off the needles. So as I'm doing this, I am joining my the last stitch that I've just worked and the first round of my ribbing together to create a nice channel here around the opening of the face for our hood. And I'm just going to repeat this all the way across. So as you can see, it is a bit finicky, but again, this prevents us from seaming later on. But again, if you want, feel free to just cast off your stitches as normal, then take a long tail of yarn and seam the first row with the last, first round with the last round of rib. And yeah, I'm just going to finish this all off camera and show you what my work looks like when I'm done. Alright, so I just finished casting off my last stitch, and now I'm going to just cut a tail end of yarn here, pull my yarn through, and pull it nice and tight. So when I open my face ribbing here, you can see this is what we were working when I was knitting my two stitches together, then knitting one, and so on and so on. So that just gives us a nice secure channel. And if we look here, we can see our two eyelets for the drawstring. So the main part of your hood is now done. Obviously, I still need to weave in the ends and block it. But now all that's left for me is to make the drawstring. So for the drawstring, I'm actually going to work an I-cord. So to do this, I'm going to just cast on 4 stitches. And then once I've cast on 4 stitches, I recommend working your I-cord here on your smaller set of circular needles. So I'm just going to knit all 4 stitches here. I'm just knitting the last stitch. So I've knit all 4 stitches, and usually at the end of a row you would turn your work and then work back along those stitches. But here instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep my needles facing this way, and I'm just going to slide those 4 stitches to the other needle. So I always have the same side facing me. And now my working yarn is all the way here on my leftmost stitch, and once again I'm just going to knit my 4 stitches. The first stitch is the trickiest to work because your yarn is coming from so far away from the leftmost needle. And then once I have finished knitting those 4 stitches, once again I'm just going to pull them all the way to the other side. And using my working yarn again, we'll knit all 4 stitches. So that's literally all you do, is just keep sliding your stitches down and to the other needle, knitting, and then again sliding them to the other needle. So after you work many rows like this of your I-cord, you end up with something that looks like this. So you just have to keep working many rows. It does take a little bit of time. And then at the very end, I just finish off by cutting a tail of yarn, then using a darning needle, and then I pass my tail end of yarn through all 4 loops, and then pull it closed, and then I just place that tail end of yarn into the cord itself, so my tail end of yarn is sitting inside the cord. And I did the same thing on the other side with my initial tail end of yarn. I just weaved it into the cord itself. So the pattern will tell you how long to make your I-cord, but once you have your I-cord and your hood, I suggest taking a safety pin and placing it onto your cord, and then you can go ahead and feed it through the channel here that we created when we worked our face ribbing and sewed it or knit it down, and then pull it out of the other eyelet. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to feed my drawstring through here, and I'll show you my hood once I'm done. Okay, I just finished feeding my drawstring through the channel here, and I forgot to mention that actually instead of a safety pin, if you want, you can also just form a tight knot here at the bottom of your cord like this, and then use this to kind of help feed it through. That's what I just did. I couldn't find a safety pin, so I just made a knot And then once I had pulled it through, I just undid my knot. But if you want, you can also just make knots here at the bottom of your cord to prevent them from going into the channel. But yeah, after you have worked your drawstring, fed it through, your hood is all done. Just make sure to weave in your ends and of course block it. Blocking is the final step in any project that you make, especially with a wool yarn like this. You want it to be able to lay nice and flat. For example, I'm hoping after I block my hood, where I picked up my stitches here for the top rectangle, I'm going to stretch it out a little bit so it sits nice and flat like this. And I'll block it to the dimensions listed in the pattern for my size. Alright, so if you've made it to the end of the video, congratulations, you should have a Nebula hood now. Hopefully it turned out just like you wanted it to, and hopefully the video tutorial was helpful. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know what you think down below about this video tutorial style kind of accompanying the pattern. I'm not sure if I'm going to do this again. It was a lot of work, but if it was very helpful to you guys, especially towards the beginners, I really would like to know if it was helpful for you. Because then maybe I'd consider doing it again for the next knitted project, or maybe even a crochet one. So yeah, definitely let me know what you think, and if you make this project, please either send me pictures via email or tag me on Instagram, TikTok, whatever. I love to see it and would love to feature you on my social media. Alright, that's it. That's all I have for you. Thank you so much for watching, and have a lovely rest of your day. Bye!